twixt time rowdies, tumbling through calendric cracks, many-shaped, comers and goers, daytime disruptors, or torch flicker night glimpses, personating inconstancy, just for a spell. Sometimes they're welcomed and feasted, sometimes killed in mock battle, then revived and sent on their way until next year. Fur, animal hide, straw, twigs, branches, scraps of human clothing, an enlarged or elongated body extended upward and outward by antlers, horns, or teetering headpiece. Fashioned from the variegated stuff of roundabout, reshapings of the solid matter of place, no doubt, but sendings too from another, less solid semblant world that, through these patchings together, makes yearly incurse into this one. Or is it that on such occasions we become passingly aware of its adjacent abiding? And who are we, anyway? Sometimes there's a human face glimpsed through fur or foliage, sometimes blackened to approximate anonymity. Perhaps those in attendance know or can spot who is underneath, but being underneath means that name and face and biography are no longer what is on display. The so-called 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany are when many of them make their scheduled, untimely appearances. But that's just another name, like a saintly rebaptism of an old god who was already just another name. No doubt there's plenty to say here, and plenty has already been said about consensually real, academically serious matters like social relationships, political and economic transformations, or contemporary crises of identity and belonging. Still, even the most social scientifically minded of observers have sensed that there is something more. American anthropologist Gerald Creed, who spent 2 decades observing and documenting the kukari winter masquerades of Bulgaria, writes of these occasions, "These rituals are all-consuming events. The visual attraction of the masks, the hypnotic sound of the bells, the intoxicating taste of wine or brandy, the bracing smell of animal skin costumes, and the sheer feeling of physical exhilaration combine to monopolize the senses. To be present is to be absent from all else. Little wonder participants and observers evince a stronger engagement with kukari than with any other folk practice. When the masked and costumed figures appear, everything else recedes. To be in their presence is to be caught up in an altered reality that their arrival has ushered in, and that, for as long as it lasts, is the only reality." French photographer Charles Fréger, who captured these images between 2010 and 2011 on his travels across Europe from the Atlantic seaboard to the Balkan peninsula, refers to these human, animal, vegetable splicings as visitors whom the community is obliged to receive annually and for whom it must, as he puts it, open the door. Fréger photographs them, alone or in groups, in the form-sharpening clarity of daylight, but many of them are more likely to be glimpsed intermittently by the flicker of torchlight in the end-of-year darkness, or, less frequently, in the shrinking nights of winter's end. If they are indeed visitors, where do they come from? And equally importantly, perhaps, when do they come from? And where and when did he come from? Edward Tylor, Oxford's first professor of anthropology. This 1885 image from the Popular Science Monthly seems to place him as an ancestor rather than a contemporary, a luxuriantly bearded human specimen of Victoriana from a shadowy colonial past that anthropology is still trying to outrun. Anthropology professors, most of them at least, no longer look like that. Then again, differently dressed and more neatly beard-trimmed, he could perhaps pass as a hipster drinker in one of the many craft breweries in my adopted hometown of Minneapolis. Can anyone or anything ever be said to belong definitively to a particular time and place? Tylor wondered about that too. He wondered about it most conspicuously in relation to what he called survivals, those curious, wayward time migrants that sit so awkwardly beside the orderly, stage-by-stage, one-way street vision of social evolution for which he is usually remembered in anthropology textbooks. These are processes, customs, opinions, and so forth, which have been carried on by force of habit into a new state of society different from that in which they had their original home, and they thus remain as proofs and examples of an older condition of culture out of which a newer has been evolved. Survivals could be found in all times and places, but Tylor often seems most fascinated by their occurrence in the rural margins and hinterlands of the industrialized, urbanized European societies that he otherwise took to represent the vanguard of human progress. And survivals could take many forms. Midsummer bonfires shooting firefly sparks into the shortest of nights, dining with the dead on All Souls' Eve as the darkness lengthens, child's play mimicries, animal and avian, bows and arrows improvising weapons of ancient warfare, phrases flung in familiar forgetfulness, hair of the dog that bit you, haul over the coals, raising the wind, trailing unattended echoes of homeopathies, ordeals by fire, weather wizardries. Critics of Tylor's theory of survivals have called out its Eurocentrism, its city-dweller condescension toward rural folk, and its lack of interest in the often rapidly changing contemporary conditions in which so-called survivals were supposed to occur. They are right, of course, but is that all there is to say? Is there not something unsettling, something downright weird about the idea of survivals, about the fact that they appear to be in the present, but not fully of it? What kind of present is it in which these traces of other times and places jostle to manifest themselves? Surely such a present must be something more or other than simply punctually itself. Let us remember Fréger's visitors received in their seasonal showings up as emissaries from an elsewhere, and I would suggest an elsewhen, beyond the world of the present, yet capable, at least intermittently, of manifesting itself to disruptive effect within it. Fréger is reluctant to generalize further about his visitors. It is very easy for the French to try to make things universal, he says. And yet his photographic trek across Europe cannot help suggesting a sense of commonality underlying these variegated expressions, a sense seemingly confirmed by his onward travels to Japan, where he photographed more wintertime interlopers. Fréger's visitors arrive at particular times, usually December or January, less frequently early spring, and into particular places: the Pyrenean Mountains of southwestern Bulgaria, the edges of the Black Forest, the lakeland of southern central Finland, the coastal plains of the Akita prefecture. Place matters here. Indeed, many of the figures are fashioned from the materials of the places in which they occur: vegetation, animal skins, an assortment of household and found items. Occasion matters too. They make their appearances and their exits at particular times of year, usually late December or early January. The actions of the costume performers are also repetitions of previous actions. Words spoken are words that were spoken before. Footsteps follow paths previously trodden. Gestures and utterances of living performers reenact those of dead precursors. Yet it is the very insistent thisness of a ritually marked place and time that allows something else, something that cannot so easily be situated geographically or historically, to insinuate itself. The non-fungible singularity of setting and occasion is also a condition of non-self-sameness, such that they become points of passage to other worlds and other temporal orders. Is this why such visitations are so often poised upon the wobble point of the year's turning, the equipoise of gathering darkness and shortening night, of winter max about to pivot to returning spring? Tylor's younger contemporary, James Fraser, speculates that the 12 days and the pre-Christian midwinter celebrations onto which they were belatedly grafted originated as an intercalary period, inserted into the regular calendar to bridge the discrepancy between the solar year and the cycle of lunar months. As such, he claims, they were always regarded as periods of anomaly or license, existing outside the normal course of time. German anthropologist Hans-Peter Duer takes Fraser's suggestion a stage further, or several stages further. in his own marvellously anomalous work of speculative comparative anthropology, Dreamtime, concerning the boundary between wilderness and civilization, first published in German in 1978. Drawing on a prodigious and eclectic range of examples, including Siberian shamans, early modern European witches, Native American peyote cults, and Paleolithic cave sanctuaries, Dewar claims that what is revealed in such moments is not just a glitch in humanly calibrated systems of time reckoning, but an ever-present, if habitually unperceived, flux of becoming, underlying the seemingly solid contours of the familiar, commonsensical world. No matter how great the differences between these groups of people, they were all unified by the common theme that outside of time they lost their normal everyday aspect and became beings of the other reality, of the beyond, whether they turned into animals or hybrid creatures, or whether they reversed their social roles. In such times of crisis, when nature regenerated itself by dying first, humans died also, and, as ghostly beings, ranged over the land in order to contribute their share to the rebirth of nature. Dewar's provocation leads me in turn to speculate that the beings who manifest themselves in the depths of the European winter might actively solicit a more than contextual reading. Certainly, the specific actions, masks, costumes, and the material specificity of the environments in which they are deployed are indispensable, but precisely as a means of passing beyond anything that might be explained with exclusive reference to a particular context. We might ask, too, whether the often wide-ranging comparisons engaged in by Tylor and many of the survivalist-oriented folklorists inspired by him are merely instances of a heavy-handed subordination of data to theory, as Tylor's critics have continued to claim. Could they be viewed rather as historically situated responses to a propensity for metamorphic flight, lateral displacement, and transverse linkages that already inheres in their subject matter? Can there be a lateral association of times and places that is not an arbitrarily imposed, coerced universalism? We think we connect them, but what if they connect themselves? Clandestine sharers, not in the identity parades of history or culture, but glimpses of not yet worlds, of a torrent of making, never exhausted in any this, here, now. Is what gets called comparison just a belated grappling with this overspill of is? Is seasonality a precondition for accessing this habitually occluded dimension of the real? Have the winters of Europe, and perhaps, who knows, of the Northern Hemisphere more generally, directly enabled over centuries and millennia the imaginings and enactments of the humans who have lived through them by furnishing a point of access to something more easily glossed over during the remaining months of the year? If so, is the fate of otherworldly access tied to the fate of winter? For the past 20 years, I have lived far away from Europe, in Minneapolis, one half of the so-called twin cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, a medium-sized conurbation in the upper Midwest of the United States, built on Ojibwe and Dakota lands. The state of Minnesota, of which St. Paul is the capital, borders the Canadian provinces of Manitoba and Ontario to the north, and North and South Dakota to the west, and Iowa and Wisconsin to the south and east. You may have heard of Minneapolis and Minnesota for a variety of reasons. But if you lived there, you would certainly have heard a great deal about the weather, which was quite nice when I left on Tuesday. Minnesota consists of flat farmlands and lakes, a land of lakes, as it sometimes refers to itself, making it a land, too, of meteorological contrasts. Hot, humid summers with temperatures rising regularly into the high 80s and 90s, and harsh and protracted winters, typically bringing an abundance of snow. Usually, snow starts to fall in November and remains on the ground until April, with the possibility of further heavy falls until early May. Living in Minnesota means living with snow for almost half of the year, except last year. Last winter was different. For much of it, there was little or no snow. None over Christmas, a light fall on New Year's Eve that melted within a few days, more in early spring, but nothing that stayed on the ground. Minnesotans like to talk about the weather, especially the snow, but last year the talk was of the absence of snow. Wasn't it strange that there was none on the ground by late December? Was it just late? Would there be more to come in January? People sought reassurance in reminding themselves that this was an El Niño year, though previous such years had not seen so little snow. The habitual weather talk was pervaded by a sense of unease, a sense that something was wrong. Minnesotans found themselves waiting for a winter that never arrived. Of course, as the planet warms, Minnesota is not the only place to experience changes to its seasonal weather patterns. Last month, much of Central Europe was battered by Storm Boris, a cyclone following in the wake of record-breaking summer temperatures, with moisture and warm air rising from the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and colder air from the Antarctic pushing in to replace it. 5 times the average monthly rainfall fell in as many days. Rivers burst their banks, towns and fields were flooded, 26 people lost their lives, and thousands more were evacuated from their homes. In alpine regions, though, the unprecedentedly hot summer brought an early winter, as the rain turned to heavy snow that in turn resulted in a series of out-of-season avalanches. Winter's premature arrival in September can be just as unsettling as its non-arrival in December or January. What is disrupted is not just the repetitive rhythm of seasonal return, but also the latter's introjection of an insistent recursivity into the quantified, future-oriented linear progression that has been the dominant Western conception of time, at least since the 19th century. Along with the devastation that anthropogenic climate change is likely to wreak through temperature increases, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events, could one of its consequences also be the breaking of this circuit and the severance of an age-old connection to otherworldly possibility? As a result, will rituals like those still celebrated across Europe eventually lose their significance? Will the otherworldly visitors be recast as ghosts of climates past or of a vanished and more habitable Earth? Does the disappearance of winter amount to a diminished receptivity to other worlds? Indeed, does such a possibility risk being displaced by a bygone episode in climate history? To accept this, however, would be to accept too the untranscendable finality of the forces driving us toward planetary destruction, the culmination of capitalist modernity's radically one-worlding project in a seamlessly global, if very unevenly experienced catastrophe, where the only idioms left in which to respond are the similarly universalistic ones of resource management and global environmental governance. To concede the possibility of accessing other worlds can be definitively lost as a result of events unfolding in the register of historical time is to accept that the West's history has obliterated all other possible temporalities, that all lives and all possible futures have been subsumed under its narrative arc. Whatever the differences between the leafy northern Spanish Trapajone, the shaggy Austrian Krampus, the bull-horned Croatian Donaldashi, or the towering Bulgarian Kukuri, are they not all ways of saying no to this? This is surely why the untimeliness of Tylor's strange concept of survivals, along with Fréger's visitors and Duer's out-of-time metamorphoses, continues to resonate in a present in which the physical survival of populations and ecosystems appears ever more urgently in question. Hence the imperative to find new enactments in the face of radically altering circumstances, to find new ways to keep opening the door. Some losses are irrevocable, but something returns, invariably but differently. Not the return of the once was, losses replenished, fragments recomposed to bolster belonging for those who already think they belong. But something more than ever was, conjured out of a time that never was now, because in the end, what survives, what has to survive, is that now is not all there is. Thank you.
If you can't see it, then you just never know.